serves as historian and director of education at Raynham Hall Museum in Oyster Bay, New York, and has been researching the Townsend family and their slaves for over 16 years, including curating a year-long exhibit on the Townsend Slave Bible in 2005. In 2015, during a research visit to the New York Historical Society, she discovered what may be one of the earliest poems ever written by Jupiter Hammond, America's first published African-American writer. She has spoken internationally and published several articles in scholarly journals about life and artifacts of colonial New York. Claire lives with her husband, Chris, in New York City. Tiffany holds a PhD in American and Dramatic Literature from Florida State University and has spoken and published widely on early portrayals of race in transatlantic performance, as well as the emerging American identity in the late 18th and early 19th century. She was the lead researcher and contributing writer for the New York Times best-selling George Washington's Secret Six, Thomas Jefferson and the Tripoli Pirates, and Andrew Jackson and the Miracle at New Orleans, as well as for Fear is a Choice with Pittsburgh Steelers running back James Conner, and Limitless with Paralympic gold medalist Mallory Wegman. Now I would like to introduce Raynham Hall Museum's Executive Director, Harriet Gerard Clark. Harriet, welcome.
Thank you so much, Christopher. I just wanted to extend my congratulations to Claire and Tiffany and Vanessa Williams on this signal achievement, which is the publication of this very important book. And I just realized today that something like 900 books at latest count have been published on the topic of George Washington's life. And I think it's one of Claire's great gifts that she's interested in the lives of people whose stories have really been pushed to the shadows of history. And she's just as interested in their stories as she is in the stories of people like George Washington. And I think that it's another one of her enormous gifts that she brings such enthusiasm and precision to the retelling of these stories that we all sort of fall in love with as we go along. And on behalf of Raynham Hall Museum, I want to tell you, Claire, how proud we are that you're part of our team and that we really look forward to seeing where this enthusiasm for interesting history will take you and hopefully us next.
Thank you, Harriet. That's so good of you to say. Thank you.
Thank you for those kind words, Harriet.
Thank you.
Okay, so now what you've all really been waiting for is let's meet the co-authors, Claire and Tiffany, and I'm going to spotlight them both.
Hello.
Okay, there we go. So Claire and Tiffany, tell us, how did you meet each other?
Well, we met each other when Tiffany was a lead researcher and writer for the book that you mentioned, George Washington's Secret Six. And so at first we met with a large group of people who had all gathered to try to impart what we knew about the culprit spies to researchers like Tiffany who were writing this book. But then what really moved me was that Tiffany would reach out to me sometimes occasionally on email with just a really precise question like, where was Robert Townsend's store in Manhattan exactly? And I would bring up Google Maps and circle it and email it back to her, right, Tiff?
Yes, yes. You are very much the sleuth, and the turnaround is phenomenal. It's like as soon as she's asked, Claire just like gets to work, pulls out every book, every map, triangulates, like it's remarkable.
Well, I knew that this story had to be told by a mother. Liz's story is so wedded to her being a mother, her child, and how they were separated. And when I first asked Tiffany to join me to help me write this book, because she's such a phenomenal writer, she had just given birth to her daughter, her first child. And to me, that was so important that it be a woman and that it be a mother. And I needed somebody that knew all about the Culper-Spy ring. And so those three things, I think Tiffany is probably the only person. And most importantly, she said yes. I mean, she worked with me for 5 years, and that was a lot.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that, Claire. That was so kind. Yeah, it was Claire, when Claire called me, you know, we had stayed in touch since we had first met back in 2012, I think.
Oh, no.
Called, and my daughter was 4 months old, and I was just wrapping up maternity leave. And she said, you know, I've got this project and I'd like you to, you know, I'd like to talk to you about it. And my daughter is now wrapping up kindergarten. So that gives you a span of just an idea of how long the writing process of the book has been in the works, but then, you know, how much longer even beyond that Claire had been doing all of the legwork of the research before we even got to the writing process. So this book has had a long gestation, but we are so honored and proud to have it coming out and to be sharing Liz's story with all of you.
And we couldn't have done it without our literary agent, Eric Myers, who represented our proposal when no one else would take it up. We're so grateful to Eric and to Lyons Press, who
Absolutely
published us. You know, it was hard to find the right fit, and they were the folks that stepped up and helped us make it come true. But there's a third person in this effort. And Chris, I want you to introduce Vanessa, because we needed her, and she was there for us.
100%.
Yes, so thank you, Claire and Tiffany, for that story, and for bringing out the story of an unknown like Liz. We've heard about the Townsends. We've heard about, you know, all of the other, you know, stories from our schooling. We never heard this kind of a story before. So this is groundbreaking. Somebody who is not unknown is Vanessa Williams. She has written the foreword to this book, and we're thrilled that she could join us this evening. Vanessa, let me spotlight you. The Oyster Bay community is so excited that you wrote the foreword to Claire and Tiffany's book. Tell us how you connected with Claire to begin with.
Well, I'm excited to be an ancestor. All my ancestors are from Oyster Bay. I met Claire when they were dedicating the cemetery, which was an African-American cemetery off Old Oyster Bay Road, where my great-great-grandfather, David Carl, was buried after serving in the Civil War and buying property up on Carl's Hill, which is where my dad grew up and all my ancestors came from. So Claire was sitting behind me and told me about this story, and actually wanted to know whether there was a possibility that my ancestor would be connected to this whole Townsend mystery and amazing story. And John Hammond, who I work with on my genealogy at Oyster Bay, helped, and we couldn't really find a complete match, but he's a dear friend and such a wealth of resource. But the story that Claire unfolded is extraordinary, and not only having ancestors from Oyster Bay, but being an African-American woman looking for a story as a mother. I have 4 children, being from Oyster Bay, as I said, but also of espionage and triumph was completely unique and something that we have not seen on the screen. And I thank you, Tiffany, for working. I think it came out brilliantly, and I'm really excited to expand the whole idea and share it with the world. So that's where I can't wait to dig in and really, you know, have my part in this whole wonderful project. But thank you, Claire, for reaching out to me when I first met you at the town hall, and I'm very excited about this whole story.
I think America needs this story right now. I think we do. I think we need to place African Americans at the very heart of the story of the founding of America. And this is a really strong way that we can do that.
We thank you so much for lending your voice and support to helping us in that work here, because it's extraordinary. Thank you.
Well, bravi to all of you that, you know, have worked on this together. and for keeping telling these stories that are so important, especially for America's youth that is kind of clamoring for this kind of information in their lives, because so many of these stories have been hidden from them for just too long, way too long. So Claire, you have a bit of a presentation you want to share with us?
Yes, I put together a bit of a little slideshow for everyone to see. And because the book is just coming out tomorrow, I realize that people have not read it. So I'm telling you up front that I'm not going to tell you the end. Just prepare yourself. And the length of it is about 17 minutes, just so you can cue up your mind. And it's going to be like a little mini lecture, okay? And so I'm gonna turn off my camera now and play this for you, okay?
Thank you for joining today's program. It's so meaningful for me to share with you the life and story of an enslaved woman named Elizabeth, whose nickname was Liz. Together with my co-author, Tiffany Brooks, we've written her story, and now, after 16 years of waiting, that story can finally be shared with the world. Since you haven't been able to read the book yet, I won't spoil the ending today, but I will introduce you to her extraordinary journey, starting with her birth. Born in Oyster Bay, Long Island, around the year 1763, Liz spent her childhood here, enslaved in the home of the Townsend family. That house is now Raynham Hall Museum. In the world she was born into, slavery was legal in every one of the 13 colonies. In the colony she was born into, New York, there was more slavery than any colony north of Maryland. By the time Liz was 7 years old, New York had more slavery than all the New England colonies combined. Generations before she was born, in 1730, New York passed a law that every town would have a paid slave whipper. Her town and every other town had a slave whipper and a whipping post. There was a blacksmith in Oyster Bay who you could pay to put an iron collar on a slave and iron shackles on their arms. You could pay a blacksmith in Oyster Bay to strap a black person to a wagon wheel to be beaten. In her world, runaway slave ads appeared in every edition of the paper. This was also the world that Robert Townsend was born into in 1753. His family was quite large and wealthy. The father Samuel and mother Sarah had 10 children, 8 of whom survived infancy. This included 5 sons and 3 daughters. But it was their 3rd son, Robert, who would become the best known, at least in modern times, because in the 1920s it was discovered that he had been a spy for George Washington, operating under the name Samuel Culper Jr. At Raynham Hall Museum, these were the stories that were always told. The story of a Revolutionary-era family whose father was a patriot, whose son was a member of the Culper spy ring, and whose house became British headquarters during the Revolutionary War. Perhaps this would have always been the story of Raynham Hall. But then, in 2005, the phone rang. It was an auction house called Swan Gallery from New York City. They called to say they had a Bible coming up for sale, a Bible that Raynham Hall Museum would surely want to bid on. Though the museum already owned several Bibles, this one was different, and they bought it for $10,000 because this Bible had the names of enslaved people owned by Samuel Townsend written on the end papers. Names like Jeffrey, Catherine, Lily, Susanna, Harry, Susan, Rachel, Violet, Hannah, a different Susanna, Marianne, Jane, and Gabriel. And there was other information too, dates of birth, sometimes dates of death, and sometimes how they were related to each other. A second page had 4 more names: Nancy, Kate, Jim, and Josh. It also confirmed that these were in fact slaves belonging to the family of Samuel Townsend of Oyster Bay. For many years, I worked to understand that unusual Bible record and to uncover the lives of other people enslaved there, people who weren't listed in the Bible. And I found many: John, William, Jacob, Priscilla, Amos Burling. 2 records I discovered with no name listed, one for a baby and the other for a man. But the most compelling person I discovered was Elizabeth, or Liz. The shocking truth was that twice as many enslaved people lived at the house than members of the family, 20 over the course of time, perhaps a dozen at any given time. Today, the museum interprets a slave's quarters in contrast to the fancy bedrooms where the family would have lived. And the public is inspired to imagine the lives of enslaved African Americans who lived in this house in Oyster Bay, in New York, not during the Civil War, but in the time of the country's founding. Could there be room in the story of America's birth for them? Most Long Islanders favored the king. They were loyalists. But in 1775, Samuel Townsend became deeply involved in the Patriots' plans for a revolution, becoming a key member of the New York Provincial Congress. For a year and a half, he and the other members of the New York Congress held secret meetings, and Samuel swore an oath of secrecy to keep their plans from the British. Just 1 month after the Declaration of Independence, right before the Battle of Long Island, Samuel conveyed a series of vital messages between George Washington and General Nathaniel Woodhull, and Robert was appointed to serve as commissary to the general. But the battle was lost. General Woodhull savagely wounded. He would later die, and all of Long Island and all of Manhattan were abandoned to the British. When British forces marched onto Long Island and into the village of Oyster Bay, members of the Townsend family and the enslaved people in their household stayed behind enemy lines. In the fall of 1778, a large regiment called the Queen's Rangers occupied Oyster Bay, and their commander, Lieutenant Colonel John Graves Simcoe, made the Townsend's house his home and headquarters. During his stay, Elizabeth had to care for the unwelcome guest and for his good friend, the British spy master John André, who visited the house for several weeks in March of 1779. Young, intelligent, and beautiful, Elizabeth was reportedly quite popular despite her slave status. She was later described as being, quote, too fond of the British officers and too fond of company. Meanwhile, a network of Patriot spies began sending vital messages to George Washington, including a cousin of the fallen general named Abraham Woodhull, whose alias was Samuel Culper. In October of 1778, Woodhull excitedly reported to Washington that he was, quote, engaging a faithful friend and one of the first characters of the city. I believe this valuable new source of information was likely the Townsends' 25-year-old son, Robert, who lived and worked in Hanover Square, Manhattan, as a merchant and rented a room in the city at Woodhull's sister's house. A few months after John André's visit, as the Queen's Rangers departed Oyster Bay on May 18, 1779, One member of the household was secreted into the caravan of soldiers, horses, and wagons. Lys had escaped. A week later, Robert wrote a curious letter to his father, confirming the regiment's location just beyond Kingsbridge at the northern tip of Manhattan, blaming Lys's escape on Colonel Simcoe and urging his father not to try to recover his valuable slave, but to instead write her off as a dead loss. Robert and the rest of the Culper spy ring were supplied with a steady stream of intelligence from a variety of sources, including an unknown and mysterious woman referred to only a single time by the code name 355, who had access to information in a role that seemed to arouse no suspicion, a woman who could help to outwit them all. For the next year and a half, Robert risked his life as Culper Jr., sending coded and invisible ink messages to Washington. Over 190 of the Culper letters still exist, though many more were destroyed by the spies themselves as they worked to avoid detection. The punishment for being a spy was death by hanging. Meanwhile, Lys was now enslaved by a British officer somewhere in Manhattan. While the name of this enslaver remains a mystery, several entries in Robert Townsend's ledgers show he had contact with Lys. He may have told his father to write her off, but Robert knew exactly where she was. Following the unraveling of Benedict Arnold's treason plot in the fall of 1780 and the hanging of John André, Robert went into hiding for several months. When he returned, he hastily moved his shop and apartment from the bustle of Hanover Square to a more out-of-the-way location at Peck Slip, after dozens of suspected spies were rounded up by the British. Robert wrote, "I am happy to think that Arnold does not know my name." Fearing his identity would be revealed, Robert ceased his letter writing and reverted to audible reports only, meeting Woodhull in the outskirts of the city to report on his intelligence in person. Near the war's end, Elizabeth became pregnant and faced imminent evacuation to Canada with her loyalist master. She reached out to Robert to ask for his help so she could remain in New York. She asked him to purchase her, and Robert agreed. In August of 1782, Robert took Elizabeth into his home and wrote his final spy letter to Washington. On February 19, 1783, she gave birth to a child. I believe it was a son named Harry. Documents later described Harry as mulatto, an offensive term meaning mixed race. When the baby was 6 months old, in a misguided plan he would later regret, Robert sold Elizabeth and her baby to a recent widow. This woman, named Anne Sharwin, knew Elizabeth, who agreed to the arrangement. This purchase came with special conditions that Elizabeth would never be sold out of New York. If Anne wanted to leave the area, she was to contact Robert to buy Elizabeth back for the original price. However, after only 1 year, the widow remarried, and the new husband, a wealthy merchant named Alexander Robertson, gave Elizabeth attention that caused a, quote, derangement and separation in the marriage, which ended almost as soon as it had begun. Either for money or sheer spite, Robertson sold Elizabeth south to Charleston, South Carolina, without her child. She was transported on a ship named the Lucretia and operated by a notorious man named Captain Tinker. This villainous character had become well known for kidnapping scores of free blacks in New York, and local papers often printed warnings whenever he came into port. But Elizabeth had never been given her freedom, so she wasn't kidnapped. She was just sold, right alongside the barrels of rum and crates of tea headed south. On the same exact day Elizabeth landed in Charleston, January 25th, 1785, the first meeting of the New York Manumission Society was held in Manhattan. This anti-slavery group included John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and Hercules Mulligan, as well as Robert Townsend, who was the sole member of his family to join the fledgling movement to end legal slavery in New York. But Robert had no idea that Lys was now in Charleston, and her new master was a violent man named Richard Palms, who had already secured a place in history as the instigator of the Boston Massacre of 1770. 8 years after that, Palms also served as John Adams' personal bodyguard during a voyage to Paris, where Adams was meeting with Benjamin Franklin. Unbelievably, just as Richard Palms was delivering John Adams to Paris in 1778, Robert's older brother Solomon was also there, visiting with Benjamin Franklin and receiving from him a special oath of allegiance to America. These incredible moments of paths through history, crossing and intertwining, occur throughout Lys's story, and it surprised me how often this happened during my 16 years of detective work. As I said, I don't want to spoil the ending of the book for those who are looking forward to reading it, but I will tell you that finally, in 1827, legal slavery ended in New York, and it had been 201 years. And so now I'm going to leave you hanging with Elizabeth in Charleston, enslaved by the violent Captain Richard Palms, Robert joining the New York Manumission Society, not even knowing she had been sold south to Charleston, her young son Harry, trapped in the household of Alexander Robertson, and Elizabeth, whose courage and initiative to escape had led her to a very dark place. I invite you to read the rest of her story and to take her into your heart as a new member of America's founding. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for listening to Lys's story and remembering her name and the names of so many other people who were enslaved in Oyster Bay and in New York and in America. I hope that you have questions for me, and I'm going to turn off the presentation now so we can share those questions together.
Wow. So it's almost like Lys was this shadow, of all of these famous people. And thank you guys, both of you, for bringing her out of the shadows. So Claire, you mentioned that the lives of Robert Townsend and Elizabeth cross paths with many famous historic figures and events. Is that really true, or is any of that an exaggeration?
It's really not an exaggeration. And when you read the book, you'll find so many of these little history stories that are intertwined. And it was sheer good fortune that that was true. Tiffany and I started calling them Forrest Gump moments. It's like, how could that be? And it kept happening right up until we submitted the manuscript. Even in the last few days, we were still finding these incredible little threads of history that you already know that was connected to her. It's extraordinary, but I think it's going to help anchor her history to the American consciousness. It's very good.
Tiffany, you're muted.
Let's try that again. Yeah, I was just seconding what Claire said. I really think it helps to show that, who Lys was and the people with whom her story, crossed paths. Like, it really was at the heart of the mythos of the American founding. Like, she really was there or connected with these people who were at all these key moments. And like Claire said, that anchors her in this very real place for readers who are being introduced to this new character and this whole new story of that same time.
There'll never be a time when the reader is completely untethered from the story of America's founding that they already know. They've got this lifeline all along the way of these points along her life that they're going to feel attached to already. And that's a wonderful thing.
Okay. And we have a question from Susan. When slavery ended, and as somebody who has gotten to work alongside you, Claire, at the museum, that I've learned that slavery never had an easy end date. But when slavery was starting to, when slaves were starting to be manumitted, did all of the Townsend slaves, did they leave the household at some point and set up independently in Oyster Bay, or did some stay and work for pay?
And this is the frustration that so many records are missing, and that we don't have a complete record of what happened to every person. We know a few of the people who were enslaved by the Townsends, like Jeffrey and Gabriel, became free people, and we can see records of them. In Gabriel's case, taking a last name. He took the last name Parker, and I was able to actually document exactly when that happened in writing. But there were other individuals who we simply have no record of. So we do know that slavery ended in New York on July 4th, 1827. And so I invite everyone, when you're having your July 4th celebration this year, to remember that date for New York. But there's many individuals who were enslaved that we just have no record of, so we really don't know.
Okay. Let's see, Rick.
I would just want to add to that, though, if Anthony Townsend is joining us today, there is a community of African Americans in Oyster Bay who have the last name Townsend and who take their heritage back to the era of slavery. And so it's hard to connect point-to-point individuals, but there are a large body of African Americans who we know were here at that time with the name Townsend.
Right. Next question is, when Colonel Simcoe made the Townsend home his headquarters, and I know that he did that multiple times, what happened to the Townsends? Were they displaced, or did they continue to live there with him?
Yeah, he lived in the house 3 times. The first was a very long visit, and the second and third visits were 1 month. And they lived with him. He had his own room, which was like a nice little apartment within the house, and they all had to make space for him, and they all lived in the house as well. It was 4 teenagers and the mother and father, and the enslaved people.
Part of what is so interesting about that is that's how we know that Liss had direct contact with Colonel Simcoe, because they were right there in the house, and the whole household stayed, including, both the Townsend family and the people who were enslaved by them. So we know that they knew each other, and their paths crossed, and that's why it's interesting in that letter from Robert when he says, surely Colonel Simcoe must have known, that we see that there would have been that interaction between them.
Yeah, I was able to find in my research that Simcoe not only helped Liss escape, but he helped an individual named Barney escape, and then also an African-American couple who he tried to help escape. But one of his Queen's Rangers, when Simcoe had turned his back, sold those 2 individuals back into slavery. Very upsetting to Simcoe when that happened.
Okay. Gracia asks, not to give anything away, but was Liss down in South Carolina long enough that she might have any descendants there?
I don't believe she gave birth to a child there, no.
Okay. All right. Elizabeth asks, can you tell us if Liss and her son eventually reunited? And I don't know if that might be giving too much of the book away, but or did she have other children? So I'll leave that up to you if how you want to answer that.
We don't want to give the end away. It's too soon. I'm going to let people read the end.
And that's a really exciting part of the book to find out what did happen, in the later years of her life. Robert asks, are there any descendants of Liss today? And do we know what happened to Harry?
One of the hardest things about researching people who were enslaved is that they had no last name. And so if Liss did get married, if she did take a last name, we don't know what it was. And so we can't trace her very easily. And then in the case of Harry, I actually found several enslaved men named Harry who became free in Oyster Bay. But it's nearly impossible to link them back and to say, well, how do I pick from these three Harrys, which one is the Harry? They also, none of them had a last name. And so it becomes very difficult to track.
Yeah, and just building on what Claire said, one of the challenges looking at census records is a lot of times it would say, the family, and then it would say, and this many enslaved people. But it may not necessarily name them. And that's part of why the Townsend Slave Bible is such a valuable resource for the museum to have, is because we actually get the names of these individuals, which so often were just not recorded and then forgotten to history entirely.
And just from a woman's point of view, if you were a single woman in the census, your name would be given. But as soon as you became attached to a man, only the man's name was given. And the woman would just become a number with no name. So in 1790, if we found her, but in the next 10 years, in the next census, she didn't appear, but by then she may have become married. It's very challenging.
Rich asks, there were three Townsend brothers that arrived in Oyster Bay in 1650. And I know from my own readings is that Oyster Bay, spanned from Massapequa on the south side of Long Island all the way up to the North Shore. Besides Samuel Townsend's direct family, were the families of the other two brothers involved in any or all of this?
We do talk about the three brothers who came to Oyster Bay in 1661. They do have a fascinating story. They were involved in something called the Flushing Remonstrance, which is a precursor to our Bill of Rights. It's that foundational to America. And so their story is a part of Liss's story in our book in any case. But I want you to try to imagine how many people named Townsend lived in our area. It's so many. Luckily for me, a genealogist in the 1970s made this guide, and he gave them each an identifying number, because of course they all had the same name too, just to make it more confusing. And luckily, my husband Chris found me one of these guides. They're not formally published. Look how big it is. All these people are Townsends in our area with numbers. This is like the Rosetta Stone of research. And I'm very fortunate to have one of these incredibly rare copies. So kudos to my husband for finding that for me. So are there Townsends? Oh yes, so many.
Lots and
So
lots
many.
of them. We have some of them on the call today.
Yeah.
Michael asks, are the Townsend letters accessible to the public? And a more contentious question, is there any evidence that Robert fathered Liss's child?
The Townsend papers are separated into three parts. One part is out in the Hamptons, and they have a lot of it at the East Hampton Library available online, including key letters that are part of Liss's story. And anyone can access them at any time on the East Hampton Library website. Raynham Hall has about a third, and we have some documents on display that relate to Liss for the public to see. The New York Historical Society has about a third, but you would have to be a registered researcher to see those and make a special appointment. And of course, during COVID, no appointments. So the other question was, could Robert be the father of Harry? And the answer is yes, he could be. How could we know for sure? We can't. That's really something that is going to be a probable or a possible part of our story. So some things in the story are provable facts with documents. Some things are plausible, and some things are possible.
And we really made an effort in writing it to lay out possible different scenarios. So that possibility is discussed in the book, where we say it is possible, this could have happened. You know, we wanted to, in showing respect to Liz and to Robert and to the various characters in the story, we didn't want to make a lot of logical jumps where we couldn't prove things. So, you know, we are honest in the text when we say we don't know exactly how this happened. There are a few places where we'll say that, and we'll lay out, you know, this is one possible scenario, this is another one. And then we leave the reader to sort of make that decision, because we just don't have those records, and we don't want to state with certainty when we don't know, but we try to lay out the different possible outcomes or ways that the story could have gone.
And you know, when our story does become something like a movie or like a musical or like something else, then those writers will choose one path.
Sure.
They'll choose the path that suits the story for them. But as the foundational book of her story, we wanted it to be as complete as it could be,
Mhm.
and to let everyone have the full story that they could then see and interpret.
Well, wouldn't it be nicer if it was chosen, you know, a story of romance, you know, by the movie producer, if, you know, Harry were the outcome of a loving relationship as opposed to some other possibilities.
It's such a complicated time
Yeah.
for people who were enslaved. And, you know, we know that Robert joined the Manumission Society, but then he also ran his father's estate years later that included 12 enslaved people. The
Right.
laws to free people, to legally free them, were very strict and difficult. And it wasn't a matter of just freeing a person. A child could never be set free until they attained the age of 21. If you were over the age of 50, you were too old to be freed. I'm too old. I could have never been freed. If you had any kind of a sickness or a disability, you didn't qualify to become free. And you had to prove that you had a skill that you could make money doing. You had to prove this to a group of men called the overseers of the poor. So it was complicated, and the law changed quite a bit over time.
Yeah. Catherine asks, what institutions or locations did your research take you to for your documentation? And I guess that might be a question for both Tiffany and Claire.
So many great places.
So many.
Of course, New York and the Hamptons. I found a really interesting key document in Mystic, Connecticut, just sitting there waiting to be found. Charleston, of course, was a place I went and found some very interesting tidbits. And then all the way up into Ontario to find the Simcoe papers, and then a big stash of John André Simcoe, Benedict Arnold papers out at the Clements Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan. But now I throw it out to the world. Maybe somebody out there has something that I don't know about yet.
Yeah, and that's part of what was so exciting, is as we were working on this, I mean, from the time that we completed our proposal to the time that the manuscript was submitted, and not just submitted, but to the point that the final edits were due, we were still making little discoveries along the way that were just adding little elements of richness to the story. So it's been exciting to see the story continuing to unfold, even in the process of trying to pull all the pieces together into one cohesive narrative.
Yeah, I should have mentioned England. That was one of the very last places we found a tidbit. And I wanted to say technology too.
Absolutely.
And when I started the story, there weren't Google Books. There weren't all of the newspapers that you can now search by keyword, newspapers from that early era. And so as technology improved, I gained access to a lot of key documents. It's very important.
Jim asks, it appears that Liz was educated. Was she able to read and write? And if so, was this typical for any of the Townsend slaves?
In the North, it was not illegal for an enslaved person to know how to read and write. We know that the Townsends valued education. They educated their sons and daughters formally. they were really interested in education. We have a very unique document which shows that they sold items to enslaved people in the town, not the slaves they personally owned, but other people's slaves. They would sell things to them, maybe as a reward system, it's not clear. And two of the individuals in that record, a woman named Betty and a man named Jack, bought spelling books from the Townsends. So if they would sell a spelling book to Betty and Jack, would they give a spelling book to Liz? We don't know. We don't have a way of knowing. But we have these hints that it's possible. It's plausible.
Yeah.
And the family had contact with Jupiter Hammond, the first published Black author in America.
That's
and
right.
Their youngest daughter copied out an unpublished poem of his. So we know there was a connection there too.
And I want to point out that Claire is the person who actually helped identify that, finding that previously unpublished poem. So
that was such
when
a
I say
surprise.
She's a historical sleuth, it is.
That was
it
again
is
just
very
a
true.
total lucky find. It was hiding in plain sight.
Can I just expound on that concept about education? I did
Yes.
mention David Carl, who's my great-great-grandfather from Oyster Bay, but my other great-great-grandfather who was born a slave. So David Carl was born a free man in 1842 in Oyster Bay. William A. Fields was born an enslaved man in Memphis, Tennessee, or near Memphis, Tennessee, in Shelby County, but his masters did decide to educate all of their slaves. And my great-great-grandfather ended up being not only literate, but a school superintendent, and he was one of the first legislators after the Civil War was finished to be in the Tennessee House in Nashville, Tennessee. So I got a chance to visit his seat and look at the bills that he was trying to pass. And the researcher said, look at this handwriting. It was beautiful in script, said that's his handwriting. You can see that he was educated. So the difference between New York being born free but not educated, he worked down in the shore in Oyster Bay on one of the schooners as a laborer, and then enlisted in the army. And then you have my other great-great-grandfather, born a slave on a plantation, but was educated and ended up being involved in the government and creating history in his own way. So yes, it was possible, and it was really up to the family.
That is such a
That's
fascinating
incredible.
history. Incredible.
That is incredible.
Just
Well,
incredible.
And I love how you shared that, because part of what Liz's story does too is that we tend to think of the history of slavery in America in very binary terms. And I think this story helps show some of those lines are blurred, and like what you just shared, like that's such a reversal of what you might think about who was educated and who had access to these things. And so there really is a much more complex and rich and deep and nuanced history than I think most of us have been taught or have realized.
It can't be a month. It can't be a day in class. It has to be intertwined with all of our education and all of our times of the year.
Fantastic. Thank you all. Sandy asks, and this is a question I would love to find out, but from the Culper-Spiring code book, we have code number 355, which stood for lady. Is that correct?
That's the word for lady.
Right.
Yeah, the number
Yeah.
for the word lady. Yeah.
Is there any way that we might ever find out that Liz was 355?
Well, here's the problem. The spies are being sneaky, right? They actually should have, Abraham Woodhull should have never written that letter. He should have never mentioned a fellow spy. He was endangering that woman's life by doing that. And it only happened the one time. So he never did that again. But the timing is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Liz escaped with Simcoe in the spring of '79. And only a short time later, she went to New York and was living in the city. At that same time in the city, Robert became the spy, Culper Jr., in charge of all the intelligence gathering in New York. And only right after that, Woodhull mentions this new acquaintance of his, this lady, who has this ability to outwit them all. And so while we may never be able to prove it is Liz, I want America to let her be a contender.
Mhm.
Can we just
Yes.
put her in the running for that? Because what better way to outwit people than to be virtually invisible?
That's right.
Exactly.
And yeah, that's gives me chills to think about it. iPhone RG Right 39 asks about the artist's rendition, and they're asking, is it a photo or painting of Liz behind you? I know it's an artist's rendition of what Liz might have looked like, but can you tell us who that artist is?
This artist is a young woman named Lindsay Levine. She lives in Colorado. And I got to know her as an artist through my son Carl's partner, Erica, who is also an artist. And so I'd originally gone to Erica and said, Erica, I want you to paint me a painting. And she said, I don't paint portraits, but my friend does. And so she introduced me to Lindsay, who painted this for me. And, you know, we can't know what Elizabeth looked like. Enslaved people didn't get their portraits painted, but it's part of our thoughts as humans to need a visual. And I needed a visual of her. And I'm pleased with how Lindsay portrays her. I think it's a good idea.
Well, and I think part of it too, that I think there's an interesting story behind the portrait, which is just that Claire looked at a number of contemporary portraits, and there were occasionally images of people of color in the background, or enslaved people who might show up, in sort of an auxiliary figure in the back of a portrait. And so she actually pulled together a collection of a number of those images to look at, clothing and hairstyle, and, and to really make sure that it was authentic to the era. So rather than, just being sort of a modern concept of what we want Liz to look like, it was really sort of trying to pull on this idea of how would she have been presented and how would she have looked. And I love that I think she has a little bit of defiance in her eyes in the photo, which I just think is captured, or in the portrait, which I think is captured beautifully.
Yeah, I told the artist all about her and told her that she would have had to be very brave and a woman who really was willing to take a risk. She certainly did that over and over again.
Yes.
She had guts.
She did.
Yes.
She was gutsy.
Moxie.
Mm-hmm.
Noreen asks, did Major André have a romantic relationship with Liz or one of the Townsend daughters?
We don't have a record of André specifically having a romance within our household. He was there for several weeks in March of 1779. And that's the only visit that I found a record of. You'll see in books that they say he visited often or many times, or that he was there right before his capture. Not true. It was a whole year earlier in March. But we do know that he spent time there. He was feeling ill. It was very cold. He was probably inside a lot. And that he was engaging with Simcoe in some social activities like drawing, writing poetry. He was known to cut out silhouettes. And they had these 3 teenage girls in the household at the time and a teenage boy. Knowing André as this charismatic socialite, he probably did flirt endlessly with all kinds of people, but we don't have any proof per se or evidence of that.
Yeah. And then related to Colonel Simcoe, we know that the TV show Turn took some big liberties on the true story, but it seemed to show that Simcoe helped getting slaves to Canada. How could Simcoe be sure that their lives would be better there? Was there no slavery in Canada ever?
Believe it or not, we have Simcoe to thank for ending legal slavery in Canada in the 1790s. He was very much against slavery during the Revolutionary War when he was here in America. But after the war, when he served as governor of Upper Canada, he put into law a legal end to slavery up there. And they have a holiday in August every year in Canada called Simcoe Day, where they celebrate him ending slavery in Canada. He also founded the city of Toronto. So if you enjoy Toronto, he did that.
And there are a number of, I'm sorry, Claire, go ahead.
Go ahead.
there are a number of records where we can see Simcoe was pushing the British government to establish regiments of freed slaves and freed African Americans, saying if they fight for the British, you know, and we promise them their freedom, like this will make a difference for us. This can turn the tide. And as Claire pointed out, you know, he also tried to help a married couple escape. And, you know, unfortunately, his men sort of, you know, did a back deal on that made that not go through. But Simcoe was actually a very ardent abolitionist. And again, I guess looking at the idea of sort of the blurred lines of some of this binary thinking in shows like Turn and some of these others, we see Simcoe presented as sort of this villain because we're Americans and he's British. And so he's kind of the sneering bad guy. But he actually had some very forward thinking ideas in terms of, you know, abolition of slavery and, you know, what he wanted to, what he saw as opportunities that he wanted to expand for people of color in the New World. And so it's very interesting. He is a very interesting figure. And it's funny to see how he's viewed so differently here as opposed to how he's viewed in Canada.
Yeah, the family actually said of all the commanders that billeted in the house, Simcoe was the most honorable. They didn't despise him at all. And in fact, the next generation, the Victorian period, sold land off and renamed the street Simcoe Street, which you'll still find in Oyster Bay. That's the street where the fort was up on the hill. Then they also had later on a hotel, which they called Simcoe House in Oyster Bay. So they didn't hate him at all.
Well, thank you to everybody who has put questions into the chat. I'm sorry that we can't get to everybody's questions. I'm sure that there are more valuable information out there. Now, if anybody has a question that went unanswered for either Claire or Tiffany, how could they get in touch with you?
On our website, espionageandenslavement.com, there's a contact tab. And we want you to reach out and to ask questions and keep in touch with us. On that same page, you'll see other talks that are coming up that you could attend at various libraries or sites. And if you know a site that you think would enjoy having a talk like this, please get in touch with us about that too.
Absolutely.
Great idea. Great idea. And they can purchase the book at that website as well?
Yeah, if you go into the shop tab, you can get a signed copy.
Good, good. And we'll leave you with one final question for both of you. And it might be a biggie, but do you think there could be additional documentation waiting to be discovered?
Hey, I kept finding it right up until the last second. I actually had to stop looking. When we sent that to the press, I'm like, okay, Claire, do not look anywhere else. So you're gonna find something. I want to find more things. This is important.
Mm-hmm.
We want to know everything we can know. And I'm willing to accept the consequences of new discoveries because the truth is the most important thing.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. All right. Well, Claire, Tiffany, thank you so much for putting this book together.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you so much
for
I
coming.
can't wait till I get my copy, and I'm going to read it again and again. Thank you, Vanessa, again for being with us today. Really appreciate your presence here.
Thank you. And
And thank you to all
Claire.
of my friends and all of the people who came today. It's so wonderful that you were able to share this with us. It means so much to us.
Thank you, everybody. Okay, well,
Thank you so much.
on to, look forward to reading, and hopefully we'll see you again at other events.
Bye,
Monday night
everybody.
we have a book lunch coming up by author Bill Blyer
Yes.
about similar themes in the Revolutionary era.
And the Culper Spirey. Yep.
Yeah, and we look forward to hearing that on Monday night. Okay, everybody, have a great night.
Good night.
Good night,
Take
everyone.
care.
Thank you.